The courtroom was packed, and the rows of people sat in intense, palpable silence, the air thick with the weight of anticipation. The dim, buzzing lights above cast a faint glow, flickering ever so softly over the polished, wooden benches below. At the front of the room, Judge Richard Holloway sat elevated on his bench, tapping his fingers relentlessly on the desk in front of him, his impatience barely concealed. He was an older man, clearly well into his 60s, his silver hair and deeply etched lines in his face from decades of glaring down at defendants spoke of a career built on disdain. To him, this case was nothing more than another routine matter, just another face in the crowd, another name to dismiss, another person wasting his valuable time. But what Judge Holloway didn't know, what he couldn't possibly foresee, was that today would be different. Today, the person sitting before him wasn't just another defendant. Today was the day that his own arrogance would be his downfall, and he wouldn't even see it coming. Across from him, at the defense table, sat Danielle Carter. Calm, poised, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She was impeccably dressed in a sharp, navy blue suit, her black hair neatly tied back in a bun. She exuded authority and confidence, but to Judge Holloway, she was just another black woman who had gotten herself into trouble. His smirk widened as he glanced at the case file in front of him. He hadn't even heard her speak a word yet, but he'd already decided this would be an easy case. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head slightly, his voice rising enough for the entire courtroom to hear. Well, he mused, another entitled individual who thinks the law doesn't apply to them. A few of the jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and the prosecutor, a young man in his 30s, pursed his lips but kept silent. Danielle, however, didn't flinch, not even a hint of reaction. Judge Holloway glanced up at her, a knowing glint in his eyes. "I assume you're here to claim you were wrongfully arrested, that this is all just one big misunderstanding," he asked, mocking her. The room filled with small ripples of laughter, as if they were all in on the joke. Danielle's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. It wasn't the smile of someone nervous or afraid. It was the smile of someone who knew something the rest of them didn't. The prosecutor cleared his throat, straightening his tie as he began. "Your Honor, the defendant, Miss Carter." But before he could continue, Judge Holloway interrupted, leaning forward with a smirk. "Let's not waste the court's time. Tell me, Miss Carter, why don't you go ahead and explain why you think you're special?" With an even, calm voice, Danielle finally spoke. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'd prefer to stick to facts rather than opinions." The room fell silent. Judge Holloway's smirk faltered for a split second, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. There was something about her poise, something unsettling about how composed she was. She wasn't trembling or stuttering like most people in her position. She sat there as if she owned the very room itself. "Facts," he echoed, mocking her, the word dripping with disdain. "All right, Miss Carter," he continued, "let's hear your facts." He leaned back in his chair, clearly thinking she'd back down. Danielle exhaled slowly, almost methodically, before reaching into the inner pocket of her blazer. The bailiff instinctively tensed, his eyes locked on her. Judge Holloway scoffed, about to make a snide remark about reckless behavior. But then she opened a small black leather case and flipped it open. For a brief moment, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Inside the case was a golden badge, gleaming under the lights, with bold, unmistakable letters engraved across it. Judge Holloway's face drained of all color. The prosecutor's pen slipped from his hand and clattered onto the table. Several jurors leaned forward, their eyes wide with disbelief. Danielle placed the badge onto the table slowly, deliberately, like a royal flush laid out in front of a room full of gamblers. She looked up, her voice steady and unwavering. "My name," she said, her tone clear and commanding, "is Special Agent Danielle Carter, United States Secret Service." The courtroom was still. Judge Holloway, visibly stunned, stared at her, his mouth agape. She let the silence linger, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. Before we proceed any further, I think it's important to acknowledge that my arrest was not only unjustified, but also a direct violation of federal law. The judge swallowed hard, his throat dry. Danielle reached into her bag once more, pulling out a sealed government document. "This," she said, sliding the folder toward the bailiff, "is an official complaint drafted by the Department of Justice. It details the numerous violations committed by the officers who arrested me, including a falsified report that made its way to this courtroom." Judge Holloway's hands gripped the edge of his desk so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Danielle's voice remained calm, but the authority in her words filled the room. "You see, Your Honor," she said, her eyes never leaving his, "the officers who arrested me never bothered to check my credentials. Instead, they assumed because of the color of my skin that I must have been doing something wrong." The prosecutor's face was now a mixture of shock and fear. He scrambled through his own documents, desperately trying to piece together how he had missed this crucial information. Danielle continued, her voice still steady, but increasingly forceful. "And now, I find myself sitting in front of a judge who, instead of conducting a fair trial, mocked me before hearing a single piece of evidence." The weight of her words hit like a hammer, leaving the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Judge Holloway's face seemed to age 10 years in an instant. The arrogance that once defined him had completely evaporated, replaced by a look of panic. Danielle straightened her blazer and met the judge's gaze head-on. "This isn't just about me," she said, her words deliberate and powerful. "This is about a system that allows people in power to abuse their authority without question. But today, Judge Holloway, you question the wrong person." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. "And I promise you, this is far from over." The prosecutor, now visibly panicking, jumped up, his voice shaking. "Your Honor, in light of this new information, the prosecution requests that all charges against Miss Carter be immediately dropped." Judge Holloway's lips pressed together into a thin line, his face pale, his mind clearly racing. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Case dismissed," he muttered, barely audible, and slammed down the gavel. But for the first time in his entire career, it wasn't his authority that silenced the room. It was the undeniable truth standing in front of him. Danielle gathered her things and stood, walking calmly toward the exit. But just before she stepped out, she paused, turning her head ever so slightly. Her voice rang clear and loud enough for everyone to hear. "Next time," she said, her words slow and deliberate, "think before you laugh." With that, she exited, leaving Judge Holloway sitting there, pale, humiliated, and knowing his career was finished. Because after today, the world would know what happened.